Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. I'm really thrilled to have you all with us over Zoom, my favorite medium, for the last of our lectures this year on the courage to be. The Courage to Be is a seminar series and lecture series at Bard, run by the Hannah Arendt Center and by the students at the Hannah Arendt Center, who are the Courage to Be Fellows. It came out of conversations between me and a former faculty member at Bard, who was the spiritual advisor at Bard, about talking about how we can encourage students at the college to engage in the world in a courageous way at a time when so many of the bureaucratic and ways in which we interact in the world distance ourselves from responsibility and allow ourselves from to really avoid taking responsibility by putting it on administrations or on other procedures or processes. And we developed this idea of a series of courses that would be linked around the idea of moral and political courage in the world for students, along with a lecture series and usually dinners as well. But COVID has unfortunately made that impossible. So one of the core aspects of this Courage to Be series is that it's all run by students, our Courage to Be Fellows, who are great and have been great. And I'm thrilled to introduce today Stecy Mbemba, who's a Courage to Be Fellow at Bard. She's a third-year student at Bard studying carceral states in the sociology program. She's the co-head of both Women of Color United and the Bard New Orleans Exchange, two clubs dedicated to her interests around creating communities of femme of color and anti-mass incarceration politics. She's also involved with the National Black Justice Coalition. And I'll let Stecy tell you why she chose to invite our speaker tonight. So welcome, Stecy, and you take it from here.
Thanks, Roger, for that introduction. So tonight I invited Irshad Manji as somebody to speak for this Courage lecture. So Irshad Manji is the founder of the award-winning Moral Courage College, a best-selling New York Times author, and the holder of Oprah Winfrey Chutzpah Award for boldness. Through Moral Courage College, Irshad teaches people how to engage about polarizing issues without the looming fear of cancel culture. While our present political, economic, and health crises have heightened discord across the country and globe, Moral Courage College offers a pedagogy for how to find common ground, even when we continue to stand our own grounds. So today, Irshad Manji joins us for a thrilling and innovative conversation about her most recent book, Don't Label Me: How to Do Diversity Without Inflaming the Culture Wars. This Courage lecture will be unlike any other in the history of the Courage to Be program because it merges the curriculum of the Courage courses with a unique practice of Courage tutorial facilitated by our very own Roger Berkowitz and Chiara Ricciardone. In this tutorial, students read Irshad's Don't Label Me alongside Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility to uncover what it means to practice courage when confronting race, gender, and religion. So please welcome or join me in welcoming Irshad to Bard and to this unique conversation on diversity, bigotry, and our common humanity. So I can pass it back to you.
Thank you, Stecy. Thank you. What a lovely introduction. Mind you, it didn't exactly address Roger's question. Why did you invite me to come speak? And I'm still totally curious about that, but I won't put you on the spot just yet. But folks, everybody in the room, can we unite and, make sure that somebody, before we leave this forum, turns it back over to Stecy to get her take on why she thought this would be the right conversation at this particular time. All right. I need your help with that, is what I'm saying. All right. Over to you, Roger.
No. You're up.
Who's up?
You're up, Irshad. Were you going to, are you?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm ready for your question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Tobias, are you around, or Tobias, or?
Yeah, I'm around.
Do you want to start off or not?
Yeah, I'm in. So yeah, I can speak quickly. Sorry, I'm in a weird spot. Just a question in relation to what we discussed.
Yep.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for being here, and we had such an amazing time discussing your book. It was really a pleasure. So our tutorial, we read White Fragility in conjunction, and obviously a lot has happened since the publishing of this text. So I would just be curious if you were to write like a foreword for now in response to the rise of texts like White Fragility and these ideas, like how would you present that in today after everything we've been through?
Right. Wow, that's a great opening question, Tobias. And it's not a softball at all. So it's not like I try, in the spirit of what Don't Label Me teaches, I try to learn from people I profoundly disagree with. And I have to confess, and I'm not proud to say this at all, I'm having a hard time figuring out what I am learning from White Fragility. And I'll tell you why. This idea that white people are the repositories of all the power, and that therefore, if as a white person, you ask a question, you offer a critique, you push back, however respectfully, on what Robin DiAngelo is saying to you, because after all, she is wanting an honest and open conversation about race. But this idea that as a white person, if you have even an alternate thought than she does, that somehow you're exhibiting fragility and that you yourself are too uncomfortable to have an open and honest conversation, I find to be profoundly, number one, toxic, and number two, misguided. Toxic because it completely ignores how we human beings operate, how we're wired. We are all born with brains that have a primitive region and evolved regions. And the primitive region of the brain is constantly scanning for threats. So if you're being told you have no standing, your opinion doesn't matter, you are living a lie, if you are constantly told that you don't matter anymore, frankly, it's natural to become defensive. And it doesn't mean necessarily that you don't want to have an honest conversation. It can sometimes mean that the way the Robin DiAngelos of this world are expressing their ideas is not very helpful or constructive. But again, we live in a cultural moment in which the DiAngelos of the world really don't have to own their piece of a contentious conversation. They don't have to own their contribution, to the tension. It's all up to the listener to decide whether it will be a contentious conversation or whether you as a listener will simply submit, which, you know, I think is an abuse of power on the part of the person who is putting the listener in that position. And it certainly does not lead us to have open and honest conversations, because now the person who feels defensive, well, what incentive do they have to be thoroughly open and honest? So first things first, it's toxic because the idea of white fragility, because it ignores what we as human beings biologically need in order to open up with one another. But it's also misguided because this idea that fragility is a condition of white people, it's simply not true. Some of you may know, some of you may not, that prior to writing my book, Don't Label Me, I wrote a couple of books about the need for reform in my faith of Islam. Talk about a polarizing debate. And, you know, I would go out and engage with Muslim audiences, and I would have nothing short of hostility and vitriol and defensiveness and often caustic critique thrown my way. And I now understand why. Frankly, I wasn't communicating very well. I mean, the title of the book, The Trouble with Islam Today, singles out a particular religion as being in need of change, when the truth is that that religion, which is my religion, may very well have particular challenges to deal with, but it's still human beings who make up that religion. And so if I was to do it all over again, I would have paid a lot more attention to acknowledging that we humans have trouble within ourselves, never mind the trouble within particular institutions that we've created, be they religions or otherwise. But here's the point I'm ultimately making, that kind of pushback that I received was utterly natural, and it didn't come from white people. It came mostly from people of color, mostly my fellow Muslims. So fragility may very well be the right thing to call it, but I assure you, it's not a white condition alone. It's a human condition. And I think, therefore, one of the unintended consequences of the spread of the notion of white fragility is that it has reinforced how exceptional many Americans think they are. I say this, by the way, as a Canadian, somebody who grew up in Canada. You all, many of you, I shouldn't say you all, I'd be lapsing into generalization, but many of you think you guys are like the worst creatures to have, you know, inhabited the earth. I am here to tell you, you're no worse, certainly no better, but God, no worse than those who have slaughtered people in the name of Allah early on in the religion, in my religion. You are no worse than those who have engaged in genocide, inter-ethnic genocide, and not just, as well as intra-ethnic genocide. You all are human. Am I therefore excusing slavery? Not at all. I'm saying that, in fact, we've got to get out of this imperialist mode that somehow America is the worst of them all, and therefore it's white people and white people alone who need to grow up. Nope, it's we humans who need to grow up. And so anybody who can teach me tonight about what I ought to be learning from white fragility, I would welcome that. I truly would, because I just know there is something there that I am missing. I don't yet know what it is, and I hope you will teach me.
Thank you. And let me say that if anyone wants to respond or ask a question, you can either put your hand up under the reactions button or type your question into the chat function, and we'll call on you. In your book, you talk a little bit about fragility, the fragility card, you call it. And you talk about it in connection with your neighbor, or a neighbor of yours, Jim, who has a fairly meaningful and important role in the book. So I thought maybe it might be good, just given that first question by Tobias, to ask you to maybe talk a little bit about Jim and what you learned from and about him.
Yeah. So Jim is a staunch Republican. He is white. He is male. He is straight. He's loud. He can be obnoxious, and he can be thoroughly kind and generous, sweet, funny, attentive. Jim is the kind of person you would want to have as a neighbor, because whatever you need, he will provide. If you're in trouble, he'll be the first one to come and help. And if you're not in trouble, he'll be the one to walk by your place, see you, and wave hello. And yet, he is the kind of person who really does push back on this notion that just because he's a Republican, he must, for example, be a homophobe. And it's in that context that I discuss the idea of fragility, and white fragility in particular, in Don't Label Me. You need to know something about the structure of the book, those who have not yet read it. So the book, give me a fair hearing, please. I pledge to make this make sense. The book is a conversation between me and my dog. Her name is Lily. And Lily has experienced a pretty harsh life, which is the absolute truth. She's a rescue dog whom I adopted late in her life. And because of the experiences that Lily has had with abuse of power used against her by her former, owner, Lily is very sensitive to what she perceives as injustice. And at one point early on in the book, Lily calls me out for giving Jim a pass. And she says, in essence, that when Jim pushes back on people who assume that he's a homophobe because he's a Republican, that he's exhibiting white fragility. And, I explained to Lily what I know about white fragility, like how I define it, just to make sure that she and I are on the same page. And it turns out that my summary of what I think she means by white fragility, she accepts. Great. So based on the fact that we are both talking about the same thing, I then, point out to her, among other things, that Jim has a reason to be pissed that, first of all, he is told that he is a homophobe. No one assumes he is. He has literally been told he is a homophobe because he's a Republican. I explained to Lily that, I've seen Jim interact with people who are queer other than me. And even when no one is watching, except for me, he has been nothing but humane and decent to anybody whom he knows is gay. And by the way, he doesn't exhibit that decency because the other people he's engaged with are not straight. He exhibits decency because he treats everybody like the human being they are. And then I go on to ask Lily, you know, even if Jim is fragile because he's human, how does that differ from the fragility that some people exhibit today when they say they feel unsafe being in the company of those who have different points of view, different from theirs, that is? Like, in other words, you know, I'm trying to point out to Lily that I do think it's unfair to label one group fragile and another group deserving of the sensitivity that they want. How about we just be decent to everyone and listen to the needs that people have? Why is that such a radical and somehow unprogressive notion? So you can see that Lily and I go back and forth throughout the book as we hash out different ideas. But it's in that context that I speak about fragility and why I believe that if Jim is fragile, and that's if, by virtue of claiming that people who call him a homophobe are just labeling him for his politics and they don't actually know him. It's in that context that I'm suggesting that maybe we're all more fragile than we think we are, and that we should either acknowledge human fragility or we should simply listen to the needs that all of us have, rather than the double standard of slapping the fragility label on one group and deciding the similar fragility exhibited by another group is justified.
Great, thank you. So I'm inclined to move on to another question, but if there's anyone either in the tutorial or anyone in here who would like to, you know, ask a follow-up about white fragility, this might be a good time to do it.
And feel free to push back on me, people. Like, seriously, I mean that. First of all, you won't offend me, even if you try, and I would welcome you trying. But secondly, you know, like it or not, you're doing me a favor by critiquing my critiques, because again, I don't claim to know what everything there is to know. I have more questions than I have answers. So please do feel free to disagree.
I actually have something to say that's kind of pushing back, because for the most part, I definitely like agree with everything you're saying, but I like heard the voice of one of my friends who I've had this conversation with before, and like who, well, I just like, okay, cool. Well, my friend is Black, and she was like explaining to me before that she has this like natural like distrust of white people in general, and they have to sort of like prove her wrong. And that like, that's different than, or that's more justified because of like the history behind it. And I don't know, like, I'm just curious, like what you have to say about that, because like, I do understand for groups that have been historically, like repeatedly, and not just historically, but like currently oppressed by other groups, that like, it makes sense to be like cautious and to assume things about them,
yeah,
which might not be true, but like just for your own safety. So I just wanted to know what you had to say about that.
Yeah, thanks, Luca. And I want to know, by the way, you know, what you've offered to your friend in response, but let's get to that after I respond to your excellent question. So, you know, Luca, again, I'm going to be vulnerable and honest with all of you. One of my many weaknesses is that I have to be reminded that a lot of people out there feel traumatized, and that it's not for me to say when someone ought to feel trauma and when they ought not to feel trauma. Like, who the hell am I to make that judgment for anybody? And I'm absolutely acknowledging that I've got to get better at automatically appreciating that people may be coming from a place of trauma. And in fact, I say in Don't Label Me that even the emerging science of epigenetics tells us that that could be true. You know, that if any one of us comes from a history where, you know, our families have experienced grave oppression, let's say, you know, you come from a family of people who have perished in the Holocaust, or you come from a long line of people who have struggled with alcoholism, or these days with opioid addiction, or intergenerational poverty, or in my family's case, civil war. Like, if your parents, for example, have not healed from that experience, or if your grandparents or great-grandparents never healed from that experience, and then, you know, had children, it is possible, the emerging science of epigenetics suggests, that those genes have not healed, and that therefore trauma gets passed on. So I say in Don't Label Me, this is why it's unreasonable to tell somebody who may very well have had a family history of enslavement to just get over it. It doesn't even make sense. How does anybody just get over it if there is something biological that they have inherited that is, you know, wounding? And that ultimately it is for any generation, and I'm going to suggest our generation now, to engage in the healing process, so that as you all, meaning the students here, begin having families of your own, that you do what you can to not pass on the genes of trauma to your own children. So I've got to be more proactive in acknowledging that that may be going on. At the same time, I'm going to suggest, though I don't know her at all, and I don't presume to know her at all, your friend might also acknowledge that when she's speaking with a white person, whoever that person may be, just by dint of being white, just by dint of having white privilege, doesn't mean that that person also does not come from a place of trauma in his or her or their own right. So here's the point. I think there's room for grace all around. And by grace, please know, I'm not trying to pull Christianity on anybody here. I don't mean it in a spiritual or mystical way. I actually mean it in a sociological way. Sociologist by the name of Victor Tan Cheng defines grace as suspending one's own judgment about who is deserving and undeserving of your ears, of your willingness to listen. Just suspend that judgment, because you don't know everything that there is to know about the person in front of you. If all you know is the color of their skin, you don't know all there is to know, which is why ultimately, Luca, I would, if I was in your shoes, and again, I'm not advising you, I'm telling you how I would respond to your friend, I would acknowledge that while I hear and see where she's coming from, I think the same suspicions that she claims are justifiable on her part, she's got to allow some room for other people to also feel that they are in a similar position to her. And that includes white people. Does that make sense? Agree or disagree? Have I communicated myself decently?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I really like what you said about like suspending your judgment of like how much the person deserves to hear what you have to say. And yeah, like, I mean, well, I mean, I'm white and I'm her best friend, so she
Cool.
doesn't avoid like all, I mean, and yeah, I don't know. I think it's like we should all, I don't know, like push past our comfort levels to an extent to, and like past those biases. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm just still, I don't know where like the line is between like when it becomes like I don't know how to put this, but like once you've had so many experiences with the same group that confirm your assumptions about that group,
right,
it makes it harder to suspend those assumptions. But yeah, I mean, I think whenever we can, we should suspend those assumptions.
Yeah, and notice that you've said and I've said suspend, right? We're not talking about eliminating those suspicions. Again, I'm not trying to be an idealist here. Listen, the way we are wired, the primitive part of our brains, constantly scanning for threats. So I'm not here to suggest that it's going to be hand-holding harmony if we just stop labeling one another. We're never going to stop labeling one another because our brains would experience cognitive overload if we stopped, trying to make sense of things right away. What I am saying is, just because you think you know someone's label or constellation of labels doesn't mean that the assumptions you have about those labels are true about that person. It's still assumptions that you're making based on labels. And so the interesting thing here is if you want to be heard, the most reliable way to get a fair hearing is to give a fair hearing, because you give your other an incentive then to lower their emotional defenses and become curious about what you have to say.
Thanks, Irshad. I think I'd love to continue this line, but I also know that one of the other students in the tutorial has to go soon.
Okay.
But I'd give her a chance to ask one or two questions. Sage, are you still on? I know you have to go pretty soon.
Yes, I am. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you, in your book, you talk about the importance of getting rid of labels, and yet throughout the book, I saw that you also label your own self. I wanted to ask, are there advantages that you think labels can have on proactive movements and working towards the betterment of society?
Okay, thank you, Sage. I realize that there's some noise in the background where you are, but I do have one thing to ask you, and you can answer it quickly, and then I promise to respond to your question. When you say that you notice throughout the book that I label myself, give everybody here an example or two of the sorts of labels you remember me applying to myself.
Sorry if there's background music in the back. You had labeled yourself as, of course, as you said earlier, Muslim and queer. And I was just wondering, in what ways, just because your book is labeled, don't label me.
Yeah.
So you wanted to.
How I reconcile that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, cool.
Can I add, I'll add one aspect of that, which is, I think we talked about this in the tutorial, and I wondered if you could have written this book if you hadn't labeled yourself that way. And it almost, I'm not sure you could have gotten away with it, if you allow me to use that phrase. You used the labels of queer and Muslim as almost a permission for you to say, I have some authority here. And so I think that's part of Sage's question.
Excellent. Thank you both. So let me be clear that the context in which I used those labels, I was saying to the reader and to Lily, look, I am queer, that's a fact, and I am Muslim, that's a fact. But, and this is the context that you all need to know, just because those things are true does not mean, number one, that's all that I am. And number two, just because those two labels do apply to me doesn't mean that the baggage that goes with those labels also apply. You see, so what's interesting, I think, is that while the book is called Don't Label Me, I know very well that, again, because of the way we're wired and the need for our brains to make sense of things right away so we can move on and make sure that if there are any real threats, you know, the brain can catch them, right? The brain basically just needs to kind of get the clutter out of the way. And so it labels. So I know that we're not going to get rid of labels. But what I've said very clearly in the book is we can use labels as starting points. Just try not to use them as finish lines. And what I mean by starting points is starting points to discover more. For example, yes, I'm Muslim. Now, do you know everything there is to know about my positions on certain, you know, really interesting and complex issues by dint of me being Muslim? Do you know, for example, what position I take on Israel, on Palestine? That's incendiary topics, I know, but I'm Muslim. So what does that tell you about where I stand? Well, it's easy to assume that therefore I'm, in popular parlance, pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. No, my positions on these things are a lot more complicated than that. And yet, I'm still Muslim, right? That's the thing, is that you can be factually something, but that doesn't mean you're understood. And the only way we can understand is by engaging rather than assuming. I'll tell you a really, I think, interesting anecdote. So when I was promoting Don't Label Me and, you know, on my media tour, I was invited onto MSNBC's Morning Joe. And that morning, former Senator Claire McCaskill was at the table with, you know, Willie, one of the co-hosts, and Mika. And when she heard that I was coming to the round table and I'm Muslim, before the camera started rolling, she told me, you know, I'll tell you something. When I was a senator, I would have to be telling people, you know, don't be afraid of Muslims, okay? Like, they're not violent. They're good people. Just don't be afraid of them. Now, she was telling this to me before the camera started rolling. And I said to her, Senator, I mean, you're right. I mean, there's good and bad in every group, but surely you can't legitimately claim that all Muslims are peaceful, just like all Muslims, or sorry, just like all Christians are not peaceful, like all socialists are not peaceful, like any group is not peaceful. And don't you think you're kind of stereotyping in you know, your effort to undo some stereotypes? And she didn't know what to do with that. And during the recording, right, when the cameras were on, we had a bit of a conversation about this, and she totally, you know, took not the other side, but she immediately picked up on my point and then proceeded to agree with me. Here's the thing. You could say she was being Midwest nice because she comes from the Midwest. Or you could say, yep, that's a politician for you, right? They'll take whatever position is, you know, the position that you want to hear. Or you could say that when she heard that I'm Muslim, she assumed that I would want to hear something from her. That in turn, actually, I didn't want to hear it from her because I'm more complicated than that. Like, each of you is more complicated than your labels suggest. And it just, again, goes to show that, even when taking on labels for ourselves gives us a sense of security and belonging and a degree of power, because now we know we're not alone, even then, it doesn't mean that that label captures all of who you are, or even the most significant part of who you are. So yeah, as starting points, fine. As finish lines, problematic.
Sorry, does anyone want to jump in here and follow up on any of these points? Or
I had a question.
Yeah.
I think when I immediately hear about thinking away terms like white fragility, I think a kind of absolving of like one's responsibility. I think of more like people who kind of don't want to engage in a conversation about like whiteness, and not as a finish line, but as the kind of starting point.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know if you could talk more about, because it seems like you my reading of it is, or is that you're seeing as white fragility as something that shuts down conversations and kind of absolves even thinking or like, critical conversations. But what do you like, how would you respond to also people who kind of want to will away conversations of white fragility, not for that, but because they don't want to engage in a critical conversation?
Right. Yeah. Great question. By the way, Rainer, I see that you've got like this fisheye kind of lens, right? That is so cool. And afterwards, after all of this is over, if you can remember, could you just email me through my website to tell me how you've done that?
Sure.
Because I want to see if I can do that for my nieces and nephews. I think they'd find it really, really fun. Okay, so yes. There are indeed some people who would rather avoid the conversation altogether and therefore claim that this notion of white fragility insults them. And for that reason, they're done. They're done before they even started. Yep, there will always be some people like that, for sure. What I can tell you, Rainer, is that if you approach them, those kinds of folks who are afraid to have really honest conversations about race or anything else, if you approach them not by labeling them fragile, but instead by saying, look, you have a particular set of experiences, I have a particular set of experiences, and our experiences are not going to be the same, which means that our perspectives will not be the same. But I'm genuinely interested in hearing your perspective. So why don't you go first? Tell me how you're feeling just about what's going on in our country right now. Do you think, Rainer, I'm asking you this sincerely, do you think if I approached those folks that way, they'd say, nope, not interested, forget it. You know what? You've insulted me. Nope, I'm out. Honestly, do you think I would get that kind of a?
I don't think so. I mean, I think when people, sorry, there's like a thunderstorm outside. I think approaching it without the kind of hostility that one person already feels right in a conversation, then there is room to have like a conversation. You're saying without labeling them first, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because my point is that they may very well be using the phrase white fragility as cover, right? Mm-hmm. To not have the conversation. So what if you took the cover away mm-hmm. and didn't use that phrase and instead invited them to just, in a non-judgmental way, tell you how they're feeling about what's going on in the country, whatever that may be. What cover do they have now?
Yeah, I don't think they would have much of a cover. I mean, I do think that there is like I still think there is a way that language fails in terms of like you're going to have to use a kind of like keyword that will kind of signify a conversation that they might also try to be masked around, if that makes sense. But I do think that there are people who who would shut down regardless of kind of the approach, though.
And again, you might be right.
Yeah.
I will tell you, in all honesty, I have not met, in the thousands of people that I've met since I've been writing books and engaging with the public on all kinds of issues, I have never met somebody who turns their back on a sincere invitation to engage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I will go one step further. Today, more than ever, I think people are hungry for those sincere invitations. I think they're hungry to know that you're not going to play gotcha with them. Mm-hmm. I think they're hungry to believe that conversation is possible, not monologue and not debate, but actual dialogue and conversation. And I really do believe that they're hungry. Most of us are hungry not to be immediately judged, because there's so much of that already that it's actually refreshing to be assured that just because we have this disagreement, Rainer, doesn't mean I have any right to judge the totality of who you are based on this one issue or this one disagreement. And I can assure you, says Irshad at the beginning of what might be a tense conversation, I can assure you that I'm not going to judge the whole of who you are. Mm-hmm. And could I ask that you offer me the same courtesy? Could we agree to that? Mm-hmm. It's, I haven't met one person yet who would say, nope, can't agree to that.
Yeah. I think sometimes I'm thinking of an extreme example where it was like this kind of, Steven Crowder mentality, if you know his, like, don't, change my mind, where there is this kind of aesthetic of I think, conversation, but secretly, I will say that I would argue that there is a debate incentive and a kind of masked, power dynamic that is being constantly, thrown around. But I don't think you're thinking in those kind of terms of like.
Exactly right. Exactly right. I'm not thinking in those terms, because that's exactly the kind of secret agendas that ruin public discourse. And this is one of the reasons, folks, that I think we're living in a time of such low social trust. There's all kinds of reasons for that. But one of them is that everywhere we go, we seem to be manipulated. We're being manipulated, on social media, by algorithms, by tech companies that really know how to exploit, the egocentric part of the brain, and know how to design the platforms to amp up our emotions, keep us on, and cha-ching, they make more money as a result. Thank you very much, right? We're manipulated on social media. Then we're manipulated by legacy media, which is increasingly moving to the subscriber-based model of earning revenue. And if you're a subscriber to anything, you pay in order to have a pleasing experience. Most subscribers do not subscribe to any news media that are going to challenge their biases. They subscribe because they want their biases confirmed. And so these media outlets have no incentive to give us, a range of truths. And as a result, our egos are further reinforced by that, right? And then on top of all of that, we live in a time of what social scientists call political sectarianism. And by that, they mean that even though organized religion is plummeting in popularity, we're no less religious as a nation. Now, politics is the new religion. And we get all judgy and curt and full of fire and brimstone when we encounter somebody who has a very different set of politics than we do. And when we live in an environment like this, where us and them is easily corrupted into us against them, it's, where's the incentive to actually engage? Well, I'll tell you what I think the incentive is. The incentive is that learning how to ask sincere questions, to listen to understand rather than listen to win, to take a deep breath before you decide to respond to something, because if you don't breathe properly, you'll likely wind up reacting rather than responding. Learning to do these things is wise because it will make you a more effective communicator of where you stand. This is why Stecy said, and I loved that she said this in her introduction, that it is possible to stand your ground and seek common ground. Now, that may sound like a contradiction, but it's actually not. Standing your ground is about what you believe. Seeking common ground is about how you express what you believe. And if you express it in a way that leaves the other person or other people feeling respected, they are much more likely to want to hear your perspective. So we all have an enlightened self-interest in going first in the listening department. And by the way, not to change other people's minds. If your intention in entering a conversation is to try and change their mind, good luck, because you're going to wind up objectifying them. Now, all they are is objects. They're playthings for your agenda, namely your agenda being to change their mind. How about you just go in there to humanize yourself and to glimpse their humanity and see where that gets you? I would suggest in many cases, it'll get you a lot further.
What? Thank
Can
you.
I jump in with thank you. May I jump in with a worry that,
so jump in.
Thank you. I feel a lot of commonality with what you've written in your book. There's an epistemology that I think is really right on, that labels are distorting. There's an ethics of grace and listening that I think is really compelling. The worry that I have comes when you say something like, how are you going to fix society if you don't fix yourself first? And that's actually, I think, an attitude that is shared by Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, that these are issues that ultimately can be resolved at an interpersonal or a subjective level. And it's also an attitude that has a distinguished lineage back to Plato, for example, who says in the Gorgias, almost word for word, right? Like, before we engage in politics, we have to take care of ourselves, take care of our souls. And I find this, on the one hand, an incredibly seductive idea, right? I got into philosophy and the academy because I like thinking about things and engaging in that kind of introspective and dialogue as well. But I worry that if we wait until we fix ourselves,
right,
to try to make a change to society, then that change is never going to come, which I think is actually Plato's point, like his idea, his whole shtick, as it were.
Right.
So I'm wondering, is there a politics here? Is by which I mean, is there something here for the need that we have to take collective action? Because you are diagnosing something that's a political problem you're talking about.
Right.
political sectarianism and the problems that are taking place at this level.
Yeah, great question, Chiara. Thank you. And I'm going to respond to that by referencing a story that I tell actually throughout Don't Label Me, and it's kind of a running thread. And it's the story of two people. You'll remember them, Genesis and Lewis. And Genesis is a hip hop artist. She's biracial. She identifies as Black. And her grandfather was murdered by the KKK. So for her, history is deeply personal. It's not abstract. Then there's the other person in the story, Lewis, white guy, working class. He actually takes pride in being the descendant of a soldier who fought for the South during the Civil War. And the disagreement, so for him, by the way, history is also not abstract. It's deeply personal. And the disagreement that they have is over the Confederate battle flag. Lewis says it's about heritage. No big whoop. Genesis says it's about exclusion. Big whoop. And one night in New York City, Genesis is doing a concert, and she launches an incendiary protest against the Confederate battle flag. She puts it around her neck and then lowers a noose around her neck and holds it very defiantly for all the cameras to take a photo of. And of course, the photo goes viral. And of course, because this is who we are now, right? She gets a ton of hate mail. And as she's scrolling through all that hate, she happens upon a message from Lewis, who, by the way, she had not seen or even thought about in like 25 years. She vaguely remembered him from kindergarten when they were both growing up in Mississippi. But like, wow, Lewis, blast from my past. And Lewis says in his email, his post to her, he says, I don't want to see you die. I really don't. But I also really disagree with you about the flag. So Genesis undertakes a bit of an experiment. She realizes that if she just doubles down and, sort of flips the bird to him, decides he's a racist and moves on, she's never really going to learn what she needs to know about how to bring the non-violent holdouts on side. So she does something kind of radical. She invites Lewis to her backyard to talk about it. And to his credit, he shows up. And even more to his credit, he shows up even though he knows that we have cameras rolling. And Genesis and Lewis sit down and they begin a conversation. And the first thing that Genesis says, she doesn't make a statement. She doesn't get all, intellectual on him. She says, how does that flag make you feel? Because she recognizes, right, that we human beings think first and foremost emotionally. So how does it make you feel? And he replies, makes me feel like I'm home. And because she asks him a really basic, non-judgy question, he reciprocates. He says, how about you? And she says, it makes me feel unwelcome, even though I am at home. And the conversation gets underway in earnest. And I promise you, Chiara, I'm answering your question. During the conversation, Lewis realizes something he never bargained for, that he actually cares more about Genesis than he does about the Confederate battle flag. And I asked him afterwards, why? What happened? He said, nobody on the other side of this debate has ever cared enough about me to ask where I'm coming from. And she did. And I've come to see that her needs are just as important as mine. Now, how this links to Chiara's question is, Genesis doesn't think that all there is to resistance or activism is developing one-on-one relationships across divides. Notice that she launched that protest on stage. And without having done that, she would have never gotten a message from Lewis. Moreover, she doesn't just end her activism with that conversation. She's part of a movement of people who are protesting the Confederate battle flag, especially because at that point, it's still included in the Mississippi state flag. But here's the point. Because they approach change through diverse strategies, yes, protest, yes, marching, yes, sit-ins, and boycotts, and yes, developing relationships with nonviolent people on the other side who then see that they too, people on this side are nonviolent, and that actually we have more that we share about our mutual love of Mississippi than we do about the walls that the extremists on either side would want to put up between us. Because they were able to build a coalition of people, even from the other side, about a year after Genesis had her first conversation with Lewis, the movement won its struggle. And the reason they won their struggle is that those who resisted a new flag realized that the people who wanted a new flag wanted it not to be exclusionary in turn, i.e., your heritage doesn't matter, white Southerners, but rather they wanted to acknowledge the heritage of white Southerners and acknowledge everything else that is not acknowledged by the Confederate battle flag. So get this, the new flag actually has, among other things, 2 red bars on each side. And those red bars are meant to pay homage, a tribute to the blood that was spilled, both by Southerners and by Northerners. This is why, number one, I want to suggest that, Chiara, I don't think it's an either or proposition. Developing relationships across divides is part and parcel of ensuring that change has buy-in, and that therefore that change will last. And it means that it's one piece of a larger puzzle of how to make change. You still need the collective. You still need, people coming together. But what I find is that many activists today on all kinds of issues, not just on the so-called left, but also on the so-called right, dismiss the importance of developing relationships across divides and decide that all that needs to happen is more of this, and that will lead to policy change, and policy change will lead to culture change. But we've learned from history that policies themselves can be overturned, especially when there isn't buy-in. And that's the reason to be strategic enough to do your march and to have your tough conversations at the same time.
I like that answer. And the part of me that wants to agree with you is also thinking about my neighbor who did deep canvassing before the election, which is a specific tactic that I think tries to actualize what you're talking about.
Exactly right.
Among many other kinds of tactics. But I guess my follow-up question veers in a slightly different direction, which is then, you say that you try to teach moral courage at the Moral Courage College. And so I'm curious where moral courage comes from for you, and what's the pedagogy of teaching moral courage? Is that really possible?
You know, just because I think it's interesting, as I mentioned, right? Though I live and work in New York City and have lived in the United States, New York, Hawaii, California for the last 15 years, I remain a Canadian citizen. And I bring this up because prior to the pandemic, when the border was still open between Canada and the US, I would always be asked by customs officers on the American side. It was funny, it always came from the American side, and I don't quite know why, but I think maybe because they felt like they had more freedom to ask questions, which I think is lovely if that's the case. They would always ask me, so what do you teach? And I would say, well, I teach a particular leadership tradition called moral courage. And they would say, that can be taught? And I always reply, actually, a lot of it can be taught. The thing is, you can't teach somebody to have intrinsic motivation to want to do the right thing in the face of their fears. Not everybody will have that intrinsic motivation, but for those who do, my goodness, can you ever create an ecosystem of support to allow those people to build their moral courage muscle, to learn techniques, pick up tools, to again move past, the ego that would have them sort of cave to dogma and doctrine. So let me be even more clear. I used to teach, Chiara, moral courage to mean simply this: speaking truth to power. And after all, that's how Robert F. Kennedy basically defined it. It's how popular culture today defines it. Speak truth to power. But I quickly learned as I began teaching that there are at least two problems with this definition. The first is, whose truth? Well, obviously, your truth as the truth teller. But does that mean that other truths are not worth considering? And my students easily lapsed into the assumption that because they're the truth tellers, each of them, nobody else's truth is actually true. Only theirs is, number one, which does not make for good conversations. Number two, the word power. Speak truth to power, right? Well, if you're speaking truth to power, that suggests that power is always outside of you. It's external authorities, right? It's police officers. It's imams and ministers and rabbis. It's professors. It's the system. You have no power. That's why you need to speak truth to the power. But that is also an illusion, because we all have, for better and for worse, the power of that part of the brain that gives rise to the ego. And if we are not aware of how powerfully manipulative the ego is, we will submit to it, and we will become even more doctrinaire and more dogmatic in our truth, which in turn means the very people we're trying to influence will become more defensive, because you're conveying you and you alone have the truth. They are living in some kind of a fiction, some kind of a lie. And even if their facts are not true, something that a lot of people hate hearing, but I think is worth at least proposing, is that facts alone don't amount to truth. How people interpret those facts makes for their truth, right? Again, back to me being Muslim. I can look at a particular passage in the Quran It's the same passage that a more conservative Muslim looks at, and I have one particular interpretation of it, and that more conservative Muslim has a different interpretation. Same facts, different truth. So I don't know where I was going with this. I mean, I knew where I was going with this, but now I've lost the point. What was the original question, Chiara?
How to teach moral courage. And so I'm getting that it has something to do with listening as well as speaking, and also confronting the power within yourself, primarily the power of the ego, not just the external power. But I'm also, I mean, I'm wondering, do you lecture? Do you do discussions? Do you role play? Like yes, what's the lesson plan?
Yes, all of the above, as a matter of fact. I can't believe that you actually identified role play as a possibility, because most people have no idea that role play is actually a very, very powerful tool for, teaching how to engage in ways that lower defenses. But for what it's worth, 2 weeks from now, I'm releasing an online course for anybody who wants to teach a new generation how to do diversity without division. And in that course, there is a piece of it that is lecture. There's a piece of it that is activity, group activity. There's a piece of it that is role play. In other words, again, kind of like activism, various approaches to a similar end. And for what it's worth, if you're interested, let me know, and I'll ensure that you are apprised of when, Diversity Without Division, the online course, is out.
Yeah. Thank you.
By the way, incidentally, and again, for anybody who's interested, I've actually, just as of the last couple of weeks, written a document called Moral Courage as a Pedagogical Framework. And it's reflections on what I've learned over the last 15 years. I would love to send that to you if you're interested, Chiara. So again, feel free to reach out, and I'll make sure that my assistant sends it to you right away.
Thank you. I will.
Absolutely.
More.
Absolutely.
We're coming close to the end of our time. Stecy, do you want to answer Irshad's original question of why you invited her?
Good memory, Roger.
Thanks. Darn, I can't believe you asked me that.
That's right. Well, I also have a question, so I will also answer that question. Sure. I mean, this is exact. I think that, I mean, I don't know. I just think, polarizing discussions are hard. And I think that I myself am somebody who has always been like, I'm right, and like, don't want to hear the other side. And I would always, be preaching to the choir or whatever. And I found myself like constantly talking to people that already agreed with me. And I was also like, okay, like, great, you agree with me, but like, we're not going anywhere. And it's just very difficult to even imagine starting those conversations with people who disagree. And so, I mean, just that in general was like what attracted me to this idea of moral courage. So I guess like short answer, that is why I was interested in this.
It's a good answer as any, and I'm glad that unlike a lot of people who have made the mistake, myself included, I've made the mistake of thinking that I'm right and everybody else is wrong. You are self-aware enough to recognize that that is a mistake. And I really honor your vulnerability in saying tonight, that it hasn't really gotten you anywhere as an advocate for what you believe. So really, congratulations for being honest about that. Already you're ahead of the curve in taming the ego.
Thank you.
Yep.
And Stephanie, do you want to ask a question too?
Yes. Okay. So my question is, so we've been talking about, well, I guess like with Chiara's question, we kind of started to talk about the political a little bit more, but I'm just curious to see, I don't know, I guess I'm just wondering how you envision like people being able to talk back to institutions that sort of promote division and that sort of ask us to think in very divisive ways. Like, I mean, I'm just thinking about like everything that I study was just like prisons and like immigration detention and how we define citizenship. I feel like a lot of how we define ourselves is through exclusion.
Yes.
And like we don't even know who we are, but we know that we are not this.
Exactly.
So I'm just wondering, like, we can on an interpersonal level, like try to talk to the other side, but how do we even just like escape that framework, or like, I don't know, like I
know exactly what you're asking. And it's a beautiful question. And I think I might have an insight for you. Not to say it's an answer, but an insight. First of all, I'm going to respectfully challenge this idea that institutions make us think or do anything. One of the things I learned when I was, going around the world, traveling around the world, advocating reform in my faith of Islam, is that religions, like other institutions, do not speak for themselves because they are not sentient beings. It is we who inhabit institutions and systems and structures who speak on their behalf, which is why the relationships that we develop within the system can be very important to changing the culture of the system. Okay, so institutions are not separate from us. We inhabit institutions, and institutions inhabit us. We are enmeshed. And to that point, Stecy, I'm going to promote somebody else's book, not mine, somebody else's. Don't tell my publisher. It's a book called We Will Not Cancel Us. And it's written by a self-described queer feminist activist by the name of Adrienne Maree Brown. And she defines herself as an abolitionist. And she doesn't just mean abolishing slavery and the prison industrial complex. She means also our own punitive tendencies, how we lash out against people when we don't get what we want from them. And she writes, this is beautiful, listen up. She writes, on the first page, no less, she writes, everything must change, including us. In order to generate a future in which we all know we can belong, we must build life-affirming institutions, including our own movements. She goes on to say, I have felt a punitive tendency root and flourish within our movements. And she ends this thought by saying, our smallest choices today will become our next norms. In other words, she believes, as I believe, that if we wage a non-cooperation campaign, as it were, with the culture of the us against them society, if we decide, I'm not going to cave or be played by or be toyed with the us against them society, I am going to bust out of us against them, you have already resisted the punitive tendency that this author speaks of. You have already declared yourself and shown yourself to be an abolitionist in more ways than one. And when you do that, Stecy, you will find that other people watching you seeing that you can actually role model the kind of restorative justice that you may be seeking in our institutions, when they see that it's possible because you are role modeling it, they will be influenced by that. And what we find is that the more people do that, that becomes the culture of the institution. This is why Adrienne Maree Brown states, our smallest choices today will become our next norms. To do that, though, to make it a habit, to role model a non-punitive approach to the world, to bust out of us against them, takes moral courage. Because now you have to speak truth to the power of your own ego, the ego that wants you to lash back because it wants you to think that you're under constant danger. You're not. That ego is an overprotective parent who treats you as if you are fragile. You resist the ego, you are then resisting us against them. And when you resist us against them, not only will you be effecting change, you will actually be effecting transformation. Change is not the same as transformation. You can have two rival teams on a field. One wears the uniform of the powerful, the other wears the uniform of the less powerful. The less powerful rush the powerful team, bully, harass, taunt, mock, ridicule, intimidate. And we find that what has now changed is that the less powerful wear the uniform of the powerful, and the once powerful now wear the uniform of the less powerful. Great. Guess what's changed? Only the jerseys. The game hasn't changed. It's still us against them.
Thanks, Irshad. Another hand came up. Is it all right if we ask another question?
Of course. Yep.
Catalin, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I'm one of Chiara's students, and for Chiara's class, we read a piece by Audre Lorde called The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House.
Right.
And I guess I'm wondering how that text or that sort of mindset fits into your beliefs, because to me it seems a lot of the methods of activism you are talking about are kind of catering to the system that is in place, which is a system that we must acknowledge was built under white supremacy and is built around white supremacy. And I think that we should stop kind of catering to white people's feelings and trying to make them feel comfortable in order to make actual meaningful change. Like, we have to take care of the people who are hurt and actively being hurt, and not try to console those who are a part of the problem, if that makes sense. Like, the minority is always the one who's facing the burden. It's not their job to comfort people like myself who are white people. We should be doing that work. I don't know.
You know, I hear this a lot, Catalin, that we should not be comforting white people. And I'm sorry that that kind of language has taken such a hold in our culture, because I think it's a profoundly disempowering way of looking at the power of grace. You might think that's comforting white people. But let's go back to what Rainer and I were talking about earlier on in this event. That if I come to you and I say, it's not my job to educate you, it's not my job to tolerate your white fragility. Now you, being Catalin, might say, you're right, you're right. But I guarantee you that somebody else who isn't steeped in the course that you're taking with Chiara, or any other course for that matter, will say, what gives with such hostility? If you actually want to make change, Irshad, if you want me to listen, if you want me to hear where you're coming from, stop insulting me. Have some respect. Ask me questions. Ask me sincere questions. I might even be challenged by those questions. But for you to accuse me of something when you don't even know me, screw you. Screw you. Not interested. Let me ask you this, Catalin. How is that making change? I mean that sincerely. Please push back on me. How is my refusal to generate goodwill, how has that gotten the movement any further?
I think it humanizes you. It's not any human's job to educate someone else. If somebody actually wanted to do the work and view other people as humans, then they wouldn't be asking you questions and having you explain yourself. You wouldn't be put in the position of an educator. There are resources out there that are available, and if somebody really wanted to do the work and kind of dismantle any sort of bigotry within themselves, they could just go do it and view people as people. I don't know. That's my pushback, I guess. I don't think it's a super strong one, but.
Well, here's the problem with an otherwise really logical argument that you make, that there are resources out there. And if you're really interested, you could just get those resources. You could access them. Well, first of all, not everybody has access to the internet, as we found out during this pandemic, certainly not ready access to it. Secondly, how is the person you're telling to go educate themselves, how are they to be assured that the resources they can access are the right ones as far as you're concerned? So that if they come back to you and say, well, I took you up on your suggestion, your order really, for me to read like people of color. So I read this chick, Irshad Manji. Catalin, like she totally disagrees with you. But hey, she's a person of color, so we're good, right? And you might say, oh my God, Irshad Manji, she's a freaking sellout. No, that wasn't the person of color I had in mind. You got to read Audre Lorde, not Irshad Manji. Well, how was that person to know? You just told them, go educate yourself. Your response?
That's kind of the point, is you could read Audre Lorde, or I could point someone to some of your work, and it would just be a work that explores various experiences. It's just saying, don't engage with one sort of thought bubble. Like if a person specifically asked you a question, that is not, you are not forced to be the authority figure for Muslim identity. If you choose to give an answer, that is that is your choice to give an answer and to educate someone, but you might not always have the time to do that.
Right.
And if you said, then go out, talk to people in those communities, find works written by them, watch videos by them, if you have the ability to do so. It doesn't matter who is speaking, it just matters that you're engaging with other voices.
Okay, now we're getting somewhere, right? Because if you just say to people, it's not my job to educate you, figure it out. There are resources out there, go get them. They're on their own. They'll pick up resources if they're now even motivated to. And instead, what you're saying to me is, but Irshad, I'm saying to that person, look, you can read Irshad Manji and you can read Audre Lorde. You can read both of them. They both think differently in some ways and similarly in other ways. Go read them. And I'm like, thank you, Catalin, because now you've suggested to me that even though I have to do the work, and you're right, I have to do the work, you've given me some direction. You haven't just told me it's not my job to educate you. You've said, here are a couple of people you can read. Enjoy. That's pretty good. And that's not the same as saying it's not my job to educate you. Do you see what I'm telling you?
I guess, but also I don't feel like there's much of a difference between saying like it's not my job to educate you and just being like, here's some direction. Like I think one is like viewing yourself or positioning yourself as a voice of authority or having somebody demand you be a voice of authority, and the other is being like, hello, I am a person with my own personhood and a life.
Right, right. And okay, so you don't see much of a difference. I certainly see a big difference. In one case, I'm basically saying to the other person, you're on your own. Bye. And in the other case, I'm saying you have some work to do. And I'm going to give you a couple of suggestions about where you can start. That is helpful. That is helpful. Sorry, Roger, I just want to finish up here by saying one last thing. And I'm going to leave you on what I hope is a provocative note, Catalin and everybody else. I know lots of people of color have said, and will continue to say, that, you know, this is emotional labor. I'm tired. Everybody has every right to be tired when they feel tired. That does not mean you cannot ask me a question. What it means is when I'm tired, I'll say, I'm tired. I don't have time or energy for this right now, but here's where you can start. Read Irshad Manji and Audre Lorde. You see, my point is this, Catalin, that nobody should feel afraid to ask a question. The moment you make people afraid to ask questions, you shut down conversation. And the moment you shut down conversation, the walls of suspicion go up. Instead of making people afraid to ask, learn how to respond easily. I'm a person of color. I get tired. And guess what? I'm grown up enough to say, I'm tired. Not right now. Thanks so much. Why should I be protected from having to do that? I have agency. I'm not a victim, certainly not a perpetual victim. And the suggestion that I am is, in my BIPOC view, insulting. So I'll just leave you with that thought, and I'll throw it back to Roger.
Well, I was going to push back on something, but I'm feeling like maybe you're ready to be tired. And
Roger, I'm more than open to being pushed back on. And if you want to end with a pushback, please do. I'm fine with that.
All right, I'll try and, I mean, I am aware that we're pushing the boundary of time, but I'll ask one last question and you can either run with it or not.
Okay.
Which is, I think your answer to Catalin is in many ways right. And yet there's a part of me that thinks she's right to say there's not that much of a difference between saying, you know, read it or read both.
No. She didn't say, I'm sorry, Roger, I have to clarify. She did not say read it or read both. That was not the choice that Catalin was giving.
Right.
The choice she was giving was figure it out yourself.
Right.
Versus here's where you can start.
Yeah. And I guess I see a little difference. I think your overall point that you can ask questions is right on, but it seems to me, I mean, this is my question to you at the end, that I don't know if you're doing it intentionally or strategically, or you just disagree, that your answer to her has to be, I think, from the logic of your own argument, you shouldn't assume I'm white. You shouldn't assume I'm BIPOC. You shouldn't assume I'm Muslim. You shouldn't assume I'm Jewish, or because there's a lot of ways of being white. There's a lot of ways of being BIPOC. There's a lot of ways of being Jewish. And the very idea that I have to educate myself assumes that I haven't,
Right.
or that if I educate myself, I'm going to agree with you, or that, you know, you were right and I'm wrong. And it seems to me to come back to the very beginning of this, there's an epistemological argument in your book, which is that whiteness, blackness, gayness, queerness, Muslimness don't exist. They're not things. They're labels. They can be beginnings, but in the end, they really need to be, you know, Adrian Piper, the artist, says, I retired from being Black. It's a very provocative statement. You know, and I'm wondering why you don't make the strongest. I don't know if you agree with that, but if you do, and I think you do, why do you sort of strategically or however not make that strong statement in response to some of these questions?
I don't think it's a very strong statement, actually, the statement that you've made. It's kind of limp, if you ask me, because even if I thought there was no such thing as Muslimness, queerness, femaleness, etc., that's all well and good for me. But that's not true for other people.
No.
And in fact, the spirit of what I teach is that I've got to acknowledge that just because something is true for me doesn't make it untrue for others, right? So what I would say, though, is that ultimately, and this is one of the arguments in the book, no matter what else we are, any of us, like any of us, including my dog Lily, so notice, like, you know, she's not human, right? So I'm not going to say no matter what else we are human. Yeah, forget that. No way. Whatever else we all are, we are also plurals. And what I mean by that is there is so much to each of us, so much more than meets the eye. Lily, before she passed away, so I'm going to now say was, okay? Lily was blind and she was old. Those were my labels for her. And factually, they were true. In dog years, she was old, and factually speaking, she could not see. She was blind. But the baggage that went with those labels, that somehow she's, you know, dependent, she, you know, she's indecisive, she's skittish, scared all the time, needs my protection 24/7. I'll tell you, folks, nothing could have been further from the truth about Lily. She was feisty and decisive and independent-minded. She had attitude like nobody's business. And that is part of what makes me realize that even though some things are true about her, the assumptions based on those truths are not. That is why, Roger, Muslimness will mean something different to me than it will to another Muslim.
Right.
And that doesn't mean Muslimness doesn't exist. It means that we all need to grab humility, a little bit of it anyway, as plurals. And my ultimate vision, should it ever come to pass, is that we live by the rules, quote unquote, of pluralism. And by that, I mean, we absolutely decide for ourselves what is right and what is wrong, what is true, what is untrue, what is conscionable and unconscionable. But we have just enough humility to recognize that our positions on anything are provisional. They are contingent on having more experiences in life and hearing better arguments down the road. And that is why I will not live in a world in which people should be afraid to ask questions, because what they ask will make me think, and what I am now incentivized to think will be part of my growth as much as theirs.
Thank you, Irshad. I mean, and let me say the experiment of these courses, right, which are not as, structured as your college on courage, is designed to ask questions of how and if and whether studying and thinking about courage for a semester can make people ask questions. And we usually send out a survey at the end of the year and ask people to talk about it and think about it. And it's been amazing to hear and see people respond and say that after taking this course, they started asking questions, they started pushing back. And
right.
I can't imagine that your lecture tonight not leading to some of that. So thank you. And, really appreciate your engaging with us and being here. And thanks to Stecy for inviting you and introducing, and thank you all for being here. This was
Thank you, everybody. Really loved the conversation. Thank you for the courage of your disagreement. And please know that I'm open to continuing the conversation in whatever format is suitable.
So if anyone wants to get in touch with Irshad, I'm happy to facilitate that. Thank you all. This was the last lecture of the semester in the Courage to Be lecture series. I wish you an excellent and easy finals period.
Yeah.
And thanks again, Irshad. It was a pleasure.
Right back at you, my friend. Thanks, everybody.
Take
care.
Have
a good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stecy. Mwah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stecy. Great job. All right. Irshad, fantastic. Thank you very much. Oh, she's gone.